Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
In my upcoming book, Weapons of Worship, How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism, I discuss the oligarchy of billionaires that the Trump administration has been promoting. And then I write, in this emerging oligarchy, no matter its particular makeup, political and capitalistic dynamics are at play that most voters are simply unaware of. But rather than offering a vision in worship that subverts the oligarchy, the power brokers in the worship industry are essentially sacralizing it. In fact, they're creating an oligarchy of their own, one that is increasingly controlled by a set of elite megachurches, worship leaders, worship ministries, and worship schools, and by celebrating the worldviews of empire that oligarchs depend on. In other words, the American worship industry reflects and refracts the image of the empire. Perhaps the clearest example of this worship oligarchy came to light this past week as news broke that the Newsboys are suing a whole host of people, including reporters, bands, and charities. In a story titled Newsboys Co-Founder Alleges Conspiracy to Ruin His CCM Business, Mark Wingfield wrote for B&G, Wes Campbell, co-founder of Newsboys, has filed a lawsuit against 31 individuals and entities he alleges conspired to put him and Newsboys out of business in the Christian music world. The complaint, filed April 17th in United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee on behalf of himself, Newsboys, and several related entities, runs 200 pages and lays out the underbelly of business dealings of the Christian recording and concert business. It alleges loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The controversy stems from a story that broke where a woman alleged she was drugged by lead singer Michael Tate and assaulted by their lighting technician Matthew Brewer. But according to the Newsboys, it was consensual. Even if it was consensual, the Newsboys have lost a lot of credibility here, not only due to filing this lawsuit, but also due to living double lives, claiming to be one thing on stage while living an entirely different set of values off of it. But because their lawsuit alleges that their ministries, quote, have been destroyed by the actions of the defendants, including their publication of defamatory articles fueled by competitors with anti-competitive motives, they had to share details about the nature of competition within the worship industry. So despite whatever credibility or lack thereof they may have on the sexual assault allegations, there's a story here that goes beyond the Newsboys and gets to the heart of the broader worship culture of white evangelicalism. And perhaps what's been most shocking to many has been to discover the details around how money gets collected for charities at concerts. According to the lawsuit, the groups Transparent, Premier, and Rush promoted almost 80% of the Christian music concerts in America, and when Waterland acquired them in near simultaneous acquisitions through its newly formed holding company called LiveCo, or TPR, in one stroke, Waterland had acquired an almost 80% market share in the Christian music concert market, the CCM touring market. In short, it had created a monopoly, unquote. The lawsuit goes on to say that Christian charities team up with these artists at these concerts in order to use the artists' platform for the purpose of soliciting donors. Often these charities include supporting causes like adoption or caring for impoverished, starving children. They're just the kind of thing white evangelicals would love to promote because either they care about suffering people or because they like to feel like they're caring for suffering people. But according to the lawsuit, when a white evangelical worshiper at one of these events watches the promo video between songs, hears the artist calling them to be the church and to support the kids, and then scans the QR code and gives their money, the nonprofits would, quote, normally pay approximately $200 per sponsor, depending on the artist and other factors. You'd think that number would be shocking enough. But due to the monopoly that was created by the industry, quote, Waterland defendants would later admit to TCA they had struck a secret deal with World Vision, the world's largest charity, who had agreed to pay the Waterland defendants an astounding $500 or more for each sponsorship generated at concerts promoted by the Waterland defendants, in exchange for exclusive or near-exclusive rights. So, as these worship leaders are standing on stage and asking people to support the children, they're the ones making hundreds of dollars here per sponsorship. The lawsuit then goes on to say, quote, to put that number into perspective, applying it to a mega group with a large platform like Mercy Me, a group then under contract with TCA, is instructive. Such a group may have 60 concerts a year, with average attendance at around 4,000 people per concert, or 240,000 total annual concert attendees. If 6% of those attendees, or 14,400 people, became donors, with payments to the Waterland defendants at $500 per donor, then the annual payment the Waterland defendants would receive would be $7.2 million. And that was just for one artist for 1 year. With Waterland promoting as many as 1,000 concerts and selling as many as 2 million tickets a year, as their website boasts, revenue from their annual ticket sales would be around $80 million. But a payment of $500 per sponsorship would add for Waterland an additional $60 million annually to their top line, an almost 75% increase in revenue at little to no extra expense, unquote. This is an unbelievable amount of money, not going to the kids, but going to the worship oligarchy. Can you imagine if the lead singer at one of the worship events would have admitted that on the microphone? They could even create a tracker on the screen to show how much they're making in real time, and another tracker to show how much money they've made on tour so far just this year alone on the sponsorships. How enthusiastically would the attendees be singing on the next song as the money adds up? The fundamental argument of my book is that the worship industry strengthens the power of those at the top, dehumanizes those below, and wages war against those who won't submit. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the Newsboys story. It strengthens the power of those at the top by giving $200 to $500 or more to the worship celebrities per child sponsorship, dehumanizes the children below by commodifying their suffering, and wages war against those who won't submit to their scheme by filing lawsuits against them. There's a moment in my chapter titled The Worship Oligarchy where I quote a worship industry insider asking, "What does it mean to industrialize a formative moment?" When I wrote the book, I didn't have access to the Newsboys lawsuit that just dropped. But as we're finding out in the lawsuit, while evangelicals think they're all having a beautiful moment of worship together, singing about imagining heaven and supporting suffering children, the millions of dollars they're spending to support the kids are being channeled to wealthy corporations and artists. As the insider I quote in my book put it, there's money to be made, and you have an entire industry that just shifts its focus toward that bucket of money. There's another book that just came out titled American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of a New Christendom. It was written by Carrie Ladner, who is an expert on fundamentalist politics in America and the radicalization of the conservative movement. She has a chapter on how these worship events that we're seeing all over the place today get co-opted for political ends, so I sat down with her to discuss. With the breaking news this past week about the Newsboys lawsuit, where they're alleging that Christian charities are sending between $200 and $500 to these artists per sponsorship, there's a lot of people that have been kind of shocked by that news, and obviously there's a lot of money that's involved in these worship events. So before we get into the political nature of the events, how do you see the capitalistic pursuit of profit playing into the causes of the right during these worship gatherings?
Yeah, this is something that really just makes my skin crawl as a Christian, that worship has been turned into something that is overtly promoting these really dangerous theologies that are very much intertwined with the MAGA movement and capitalism. So what's so interesting that you brought up the Newsboys scandal. So Michael Tate, he started out with DC Talk, and I think he's the subject of a lot of the lawsuit. If you were anywhere near American youth group culture after the Columbine shooting, you probably remember this book, Jesus Freaks.
Yes.
It was written by DC Talk to promote their understanding of martyrdom, especially in light of the story that circulated that at least one, probably two of the students who died as martyrs. We now know that that was not correct. That's not an accurate rendering of events. But this was part of that martyr hysteria, the DC Talk book, Jesus Freaks, which is like an update of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which in itself is actually an extremely political text. If you've ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs, it's very much about promoting Protestantism over Catholicism, which at the time was a very political endeavor. So this book, you see, it's got kind of the same cover style. It's supposed to look old and kind of tattered. And you see here Michael Tate, Toby Mac and Michael Tate. So Kevin was no longer working with them at this point. But they actually worked with wall builders, with David Barton's organization, to put this book together that promotes an overtly Christian nationalist understanding of American history. So I'm appalled by it. And especially, I work with children's services, and this idea of profiteering off of children who are in crisis, also as a Christian, I mean, my skin is just crawling at this whole scandal that you're investigating and reporting on. But unfortunately, I'm just not surprised by it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, a lot of times we just assume these guys are just singing these really great songs on the radio. They're putting on these great, gatherings where people can come together despite your denominational background and worship God. But then like you kind of get hints of this with that book or with the movies that they're involved with, the God's Not Dead movies, and it's like you start to realize there's something underneath a lot of this, and I think people can kind of see that, but then when you actually see the bottom line of how much money is being made, not just off of ticket sales, but off of like supporting kids, it can be kind of disturbing.
Yeah, that's just so, I hate that so much. One thing that I've seen really is how much these dangerous far right ideologies are getting laundered through worship music. And so the music is promoting, it's really catchy and it's fun to sing, and you want your kids to listen to it while you're in the car, but you don't realize that the subtle influence of these dangerous far right ideologies that is coming in through the worship music. And yeah, the best word that I think to describe it is how it's being laundered.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. So as you describe these worship events, as a lot of people are seeing a lot of these different events that are being utilized to promote the Trump administration, you have a chapter on this in your book. What are some of the
Mhm.
different people behind these events, and what's setting them apart from one another?
Well, the most important worship leader within the Dominionist movement is probably Sean Foyt, at least in the present moment. It would be Sean Foyt. I have a chapter on him and on his Let Us Worship movement. And what I find so fascinating is if we go back to the latter rain revival of the mid 20th century, we see this theology emerge that claims that worship is a weapon. So it's a means of communing with God, it's a means of expressing love for God, but in addition to these things, it is a weapon to be wielded against our enemies. Sean Foyt does not talk a lot about theology. He tries to present himself as just pure, we're worshiping God, this is all that we're doing, we're bringing the kingdom down to earth. But if you can look at the theological lineage of the New Apostolic Reformation, we find that it does trace back to the latter rain revival, and that's where we have this idea worship is a weapon. Now, who are the enemies that we're using our worship against? Well, some might say we're against demons or against depression or anxiety. We're worshiping in the face of these. We're declaring that God is still God in the face of the struggles that we are seeing. And that might be, you know, I'm not going to be too prone to disagree with an individual who is having that kind of an experience with God through their worship, that they are pushing through, fighting depression. I'm not going to argue with that individual experience. But what is so dangerous is that if we look at the bigger picture, we really see that Sean Foyt is using his own brand of worship as an attack against not a principality per se, like a demon or a mental illness or struggles that people are facing in their daily lives. But we see that he actually is using his worship against people. And we saw this really with the Black Lives Matter movement. the Let Us Worship tour began in the summer of 2020, which was the same time as the George Floyd protest. And Floyd went to a lot of cities that were experiencing chaos and upheaval because of the George Floyd murder, and calls for racial equity, for ending of police violence. And he was staging, it looked like counter protests. And we also know that he's adamantly against Black Lives Matter. The whole Bethel Church ecosystem that he comes from is opposed to Black Lives Matter. They see it as demonic. And so they see the people who were protesting in the summer of 2020 because of the George Floyd murder. They see these people as being led by demons. And they are, Foyt especially, leading the charge, is trying to use worship as a way of rejecting this push for racial equality, saying that it is, you know, demonically driven. And then we see this again as his worship rally goes to the Washington Mall, the U.S. Capitol, right before the 2020 election, again, right before the 2024 election. He's unabashedly promoting the MAGA ideology and Donald Trump.
Yeah, and it's interesting that one of the common themes that you'll see at these events is they'll talk about the battles in the Hebrew Bible. So, like at the DC event in 2024, Russell Johnson was one of the pastors there, and he said that we're on the I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said we're here on the wall with a trumpet in one hand and a sword in the other to call the nation back to God. It's like, how is that not a threat? And then like you've got
Mm-hmm.
this other event, I covered this last year in Seattle, where Ross Johnston was leading that one, and they were literally yelling at these LGBTQ neighbors in the neighborhood, and they were calling them giants or Goliaths, and they were literally pretending to pick up rocks and throw them at them. And so it's like if you imagine being, one of the neighbors there around the perimeter of this thing, like you don't know if those are invisible rocks that they're throwing at demons that are controlling you. Like you just see their arm motions and you see them yelling at you, and it's like it's just so dehumanizing.
Right. But we see again this idea that worship is a weapon. And again, it makes my skin crawl because it's not, I just don't understand how people could imagine that this means of communing with God, is supposed to be a weapon wielded against people who are made in God's image. But that is what we are seeing.
Yeah. So the title of your book is American Dominion. How do you define
Mhm.
dominionism, and how does worship play into its goal?
Dominionism is broadly the belief that either God has given Christian dominion over all things, meaning that we just need to claim it, we need to claim the dominion that is already ours, or that God has called Christians to take dominion over all things. So it's more on the charismatic side that we see this idea that God has given us dominion over all things, that we have authority over all things. We can call down from heaven the things that rightfully belong to us in order to establish the rule and reign of Jesus Christ. And then on the more Calvinistic side, I'm going to say the neo-Calvinistic side, because this is not historical Calvinism, but the Doug Wilson, Rush-Junie Reconstructionists, and then the David Barton component as well. He's not necessarily Reconstructionist, but definitely Dominionist, which is the idea that God has called us to take dominion over all things. It might not be ours yet, but we are running full steam ahead, taking what should be ours.
And this is where like those 24/7 worship ministries that you mentioned come into play, or when they talk about taking territory for God by purchasing real estate for God and different things like that.
Oh my gosh, you just described Sean Foyt purchasing real estate for God. He's laundering so much money through real estate. But yes, Mike Bickle was really the architect of a lot of this paradigm. He didn't necessarily promote this idea that worship is a weapon. He didn't disagree with it, but he didn't promote it the way that Foyt does. It wasn't front and center. What he was promoting is this idea of the worship as we're recreating the tabernacle of David. And we have this altar that is going to burn with nonstop worship 24/7. And it's out of this that we get the International House of Prayer. Foyt is not necessarily aligned with the International House of Prayer or what was the International House of Prayer, but he comes out of that same theological tradition. And so when he is talking about we're going to use worship as our weapon against our enemies, what he's getting at is this belongs to us already. America belongs to us. God has given America to us. And it is our job to stick our flag in the ground and say, this is where we are, and you're not going to move us. And at the same time, using worship to eradicate any demonic forces that are causing people to, for some reason, disagree with him, whether they be queer and living out their identities as queer individuals, whether they be Democrats, people pursuing racial justice. They're the enemies, and we're attacking them with our worship because God has given this land, this country to us, because we have dominion over this.
So, in your chapter on Sean Feucht's Let Us Worship, you talk about his differences with California Governor Gavin Newsom, especially with the COVID lockdowns. How did the COVID lockdowns challenge Feucht's pursuit of dominionism?
Well, a really important event within that is I didn't get to it in American Dominion, but Cheon, who was a really significant formative person for Sean Feucht. He is an apostle based in the Los Angeles area, has something like 60,000 churches that submit to his singular authority. He filed a lawsuit against the California governor because churches were not allowed to open. And he won. I think it went to the Supreme Court, and Cheon won, saying that we have to be able to worship in churches. So it's not like Feucht was acting alone. There was definitely a lot of momentum behind him. And if you remember back in 2020, the first couple of weeks, we were scared. We didn't know what was going on. We were willing to comply with the stay-at-home orders. But after a couple of months, people are getting tired of that. And people are ready to just get back to their lives. And so there was a lot. And then at the time of the George Floyd murder, this was a really significant turning point because while people are not able to gather in churches, nobody seems to have any issue with thousands of protesters gathering in the streets and demanding racial justice. And unfortunately, we did see rioting and looting in some of these places. And so this really stirred him up and made him feel like the enemies of God are able to gather. And what was actually happening with the COVID restrictions was an attack specifically on the people of God. And then when churches were allowed to reopen to the public again, when people could start attending church again, there was an order that you couldn't sing. And Feucht saw this as an attack on his understanding of worship, which is that, again, worship is such an essential part of the Christian experience because this is how we are asserting our dominion in the spiritual realm, driving away the demons and the forces of darkness. And that's what really broke him and led him to begin his Let Us Worship tour.
Yeah, it's like if you start with the assumption that worship is a weapon, and then Governor Gavin Newsom says you can't be singing loudly together, unmasked and unsocially distanced, then to Feucht, it feels like he's being disarmed.
Right. And again, what really boggles my mind is I have always held to this belief that worship is not just about singing. It is our lifestyle that is used to glorify God. Worship consists of the acts that we do to serve other people, to care for other people, to make the world a better place, and to show our love for God. It is by no means limited to singing, but for some reason, Feucht has limited it to only singing. That seems to be the only understanding of worship.
Well, and also if you were to switch the assumption from worship being a weapon to worship being an opportunity to love your neighbor as yourself, you might come to completely different conclusions during a global
Hmm.
pandemic.
Exactly. And when during the COVID pandemic, most of the people that I was interacting with were elderly or immune compromised. And I felt like it was an act of love for God and love for my neighbor, like it was an act of worship to make sure that I'm socially distancing and doing everything I can to not become infected because I don't want to infect the people that I love.
So we fast forward to today, and we've got like the Pete Hegseth worship events at the Pentagon. We now have multiple departments doing these worship services. We've got Sean Foyt coming up on the National Mall. We've got the rededication of America to being under God on the National Mall. And like, I'll point out the Christian nationalism, dominionism, authoritarianism side of this stuff. And oftentimes I'll hear people say, well, like, oh, you're just offended at Christians singing songs? Like, this is just innocent worship. And, but it's
But it's
like,
not.
yeah. So like, how do these celebrations get translated into promoting political policy that harms people?
Yeah, well, you have to think again, like I said, the ideologies are being laundered through worship. And so while some people, plenty of people, are just blissfully ignorant of the extent of political alliances that are occurring within and behind the scenes of these worship rallies, and not understanding how much these worship rallies are being used to promote political. And I would say is so blissfully unaware. I would love to not know what I know, to not have to be concerned about these things. But this is not just you back in the 90s or 2000s before the Tea Party came onto the scene, before MAGA came onto the scene. This is not just like you're going to church to a worship event. This is a very different thing where, we can't talk about Pete Hegseth and his understanding of Christian nationalism without talking about Doug Wilson, who was his pastor. And I have a whole chapter about Doug Wilson. He is a straight up neo Confederate. And so for us to be, for US tax dollars to be funding worship services that are under the auspices of Pete Hegseth or through any alliance with Pete Hegseth, we need to pull back these layers and understand, where is neo Confederacy being promoted in all of this?
Yeah, and then also when you think about how worship, in a sense, it's like it's a confession of hope for justice, then you have to wonder, okay, then what does a neo-Confederate think justice is, and how might that be spilling over into the worship?
Yeah, and in this mindset, justice is it is justice for white people. And it is white people having dominion over all things. And what I did in American Dominion is I showed that so much of the history of this dominionist movement is tied into British Israelism and the Ku Klux Klan, including the history of the Latter Rain and the New Apostolic Reformation. So we really should not be surprised at the level of white nationalism that we are seeing alongside of these worship rallies.
So one of the concerns I have is that so much of our fixation today is on Trump and whatever latest thing Trump posted, which obviously needs to have attention drawn to it, that I think it could be easy for us to forget that authoritarian dominion theology has been around much longer than Trump, and it's going to be
Hmm.
around after Trump. How do you see
Hmm.
dominionism evolving when Trump is gone, especially when they don't have this like brash celebrity at the top of their movement?
Yeah, I think that we do need to recognize that this is not just about Trump. Trump was definitely a means to an end of being able to assert the what's called the Seven Mountain Mandate throughout American culture, but especially within American government. Oh, so we need to pay really close attention to the Heritage Foundation, which is the organization that put out Project 2025, and be aware that many of the objectives of Project 2025 have been fulfilled. And additionally, the guy behind the leader of the Heritage Foundation, it's Kevin something. His name is slipping my mind at the moment. He wrote a book that basically explains Project 2025 for a layperson called Dawn's Early Light: Taking Back Washington to Save America. The original title of the book was Dawn's Early Light, Burning Down Washington to Save America. The person who wrote the preface to it was J.D. Vance. So it is very, very important for us to understand that, yes, Donald Trump is in very questionable health. His mental status is questionable at best. But there is this whole army, and I do not say the word army metaphorically, because I am referring very much to the militia movements and how all of these dominionists are tied into the militia movements, especially the New Apostolic Reformation and the Neo-Confederates, including Doug Wilson. It's so important for us to understand that this subversion of government that we have seen over the past year and a half since Trump retook office, this is part of a broader agenda to implement the Seven Mountain Mandate, or to, in an even more extreme version, to move towards a Rushdoony-style theocracy. Because one of the primary influences at the Heritage Foundation, back when it was founded, especially during the 1980s, was Ross's John Rushdoony, who was the author of Reconstructionism, which profoundly influenced Doug Wilson, as well as the Duggar family. So these tentacles run extremely deep. What we've seen in recent years is just how much power they have been able to access. I would love to see it in our midterm elections that we're able to turn the tide on that, and we're able to begin the process of recovering our democracy. But we also need to understand just how deeply entrenched this is, not just within our power systems, but within our churches, within our communities, within these institutions that we interact with on a regular basis.
And I think that's a great point, because a big part of my concern is the dynamics within a church community are so important, because when they take those dynamics outside their walls through their idea of the Great Commission to the city at large, whatever is happening within their walls is going to spill out into the community. And I think that's what we're seeing today.
Right. And that can be a really positive thing. It can be a really wonderful thing when we see the church taking initiative on things that really do serve the people in our community, that really have a measurably positive impact on our community. When we see churches that are actively working to build meaningful connections with people of other faiths, build better understanding and relationships with people who are of other faiths, when our churches are actively working to promote better healthcare access, when our churches are working to ensure food security for the people in our communities, that is such a positive thing, and we want to see those ripple effects happen out in the bigger community. But when we see our churches promoting dominion theology, when we see them singing the songs that are also promoted by Sean Foyt, when we see them promoting his worship rallies and helping people get tickets, or not tickets, but be able to attend his worship rallies, and even chartering buses to go to the January 6th attack. These are things that we have to take very seriously, and we need to understand that things like January 6th did not begin on the National Mall. They began in our churches.
Well, I appreciate the awareness that you're bringing to this conversation. Are there any places that people can find you?
Substack would be the best place. I'm working on building up a Substack page. I'm actually working with somebody who grew up in the hardest white supremacism. Like, his family was connected to the Order, which was a terrorist organization in the 1980s that committed bank robberies and bombings and killed Alan Berg. Working with him to show the growth of white supremacism. I'm working on building that up on my Substack page. So yeah, you can find me there.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.